There are times when we see, and then there are times when we really see, kind of like this picture up here on the screens. We all know what that feels like and looks like, right? When our eyes are wide open. There are times when we see, and then there are times when we're like this man, when we really see. I had been a serious biker for about 10 years. I had gone on bike rides of 50, 100, even 500 miles. 3 times, my son Jonathan and I, we biked from Kansas City, Missouri, to St. Louis, Missouri. So I felt like I was a pretty serious biker. But still, during that era of my life, most bikes looked pretty much the same. A bike was a bike was a bike. But all of that changed on October 8th, 2016. October 8th, 2016. Some of you were here at that Saturday night service. What happened on October 8th, 2016? St. Michael gave me a bike. Not an ordinary bike. This is a specialized bike. This is a specialized elite bike. This is a specialized elite bike with a carbon frame, with Michelin tires, with disc brakes, and with Shimano 105 components. Oh, I laid my eyes on this beauty, and I had a song to sing. Get your motor running, right? This is Steppenwolf, by the way. Heading on a highway, looking for adventure. With this bike, I was born. Oh, I was born to be what? Born to be wild. There are times when we see, and then there are times when we really see. We all know what it's like to really see a bike, right? Or a boat, or a lake cabin, or a cute little kitty cat that we just have to buy. We all know what it feels like to see the love of our life. But do we know what it's like to see Jesus? Really see Jesus. That's the goal of this sermon. To open our eyes again, to clear all the fog away, to ask God to lift the veil so we can see Jesus. This is the year of John at St. Michael. So far, members have gone through 3 different sermon series on the Gospel of John. And now we turn to the book of Revelation during this joyful Easter tide. Another book that John writes. And we're calling this sermon series the 7 Churches in Revelation. There they are. You can see them. They would be in the western tip of what we call the nation of Turkey. So for the next couple months, we are going to hear what Jesus says to these 7 churches and hear what he says to us through these letters to the 7 churches. In fact, hearing is so important that Jesus ends each of these 7 letters with these words. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. But according to the logic, the flow of Revelation 1, 2, and 3, before we can hear what the Spirit says to the churches, before we can hear Jesus, we need to see Jesus. Eyes, and then ears. This is the way God often calls people in the Bible. Eyes and then ears. Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, St. Paul. And now today, us. If I want to hear Jesus, and I want to hear him. Sometimes it's hard to hear Jesus, but it all begins with seeing Jesus. That's how our second lesson today opens up, right? In Revelation 1:11. Right on a scroll, this is Jesus directing these words to John. what you see. You see, if you look at the book of Revelation, which we've been doing now for about 4 months here in my adult Bible class, if you are in the book of Revelation, I have told you many times that seeing verbs appear 81 times in the book. If the book of Revelation is about anything, it's about opening our eyes to the beauty and the majesty and the mercy of Jesus. So John is to tell these churches what he sees, right? Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. In fact, seeing is so important to hearing and responding and living that the book of Revelation begins with this emphasis on seeing, right? The first word is revelation. Many of us know that the Greek there, at least many of the district presidents know that the Greek there, and of course our great first-year seminarian from the local seminary knows that the Greek word there is apocalypsis. That's where, of course, all of us can figure this out, where we get the word apocalyptic. What does that mean? It means to show, to reveal. It means to have people open their eyes to spiritual realities. So that's the goal of the book. Eyes and then ears. So the revelation, the unveiling of Jesus, which God gave him to show his servants. Showing here is another very important word here. Not showing the abstract, but showing the concrete. Through numbers and colors and dramatic visions. John wants us to see Jesus. And seeing Jesus, we begin to hear Jesus much more clearly. So what does John see? John sees this Jesus. Now, this is not the Jesus we normally think of in our mind's eye, right? This is the reigning Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, the returning Jesus. Let me just point out a couple items here in this picture, which, as I said, is on the front of your bulletin. The sun shining in all its brilliance would be there. The clouds, we're going to come back to the clouds. Of course, there's John. We'll come back to that. He's flat on his face. Thinks he's dead. The 7 lampstands are prominent here. Jesus has 7 stars in his right hand. He's wearing a beautiful white garment. He has eyes blazing fire, and he has got a powerful voice, and that is a sword that is double-edged. In this vision that John has, Christ is in the midst of the 7 lampstands. And we're told, right, that the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches that we're going to be looking at in the next couple of months. These 7 churches are in a mass. District presidents know something about that occasionally, right? That every church in every age faces persecution from the outside and compromise from the inside. The good news here is that Jesus is still in the midst of the mass. He hasn't abandoned the churches, the compromising churches, the lukewarm churches, the churches that have the reputation of being alive, but they're really dead. Revelation 3, verse 1. John wants us to see this Jesus. Not just to glimpse and glance, not to peek or just preview. John wants us to pull up a chair, get out our bifocals, binoculars, get out the telescope and the microscope, and really see this Jesus in the midst of the mass. What is Jesus doing here in the midst of the mess? Well, let's take a closer look. First thing John tells us is he sees someone like the Son of Man. Like the Son of Man. This is Jesus' favorite title for himself. Many of us know that, right? 88 times in the New Testament, Jesus is called Son of Man. Of course, he gets that from Daniel chapter 7. And as Son of Man, Christ is present with power. Because Daniel 7 teaches this. In Daniel's vision, he sees the Son of Man with the clouds. Big idea, right? In the picture on the front of your bulletin. With the clouds. And he has authority, glory, and sovereign power. That's the Son of Man. Have you ever wondered why the big things in Jesus' ministry are accompanied with clouds? His baptism, of course, his transfiguration, his ascension, and his second coming. That would be Revelation 1:7. John says, see, he's coming with the clouds. Why all the clouds surrounding Jesus? Because Jesus is Daniel's Son of Man. Who has authority and glory and sovereign power. Power over what? Power over every enemy that is attacking the church. Power over every enemy that attacks you. Oh, and the book of Revelation has all kinds of enemies, right? At the top of the list would be the dragon, the ancient serpent who is devil and Satan. And then there are these beasts that start coming, first in chapter 11 and then in chapter 13. And one beast is called 666. The other beast is called the false prophet. And then there are massive armies surrounding the church, surrounding the believer, called Gog and Magog in chapter 20. And John says they are as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And don't forget another enemy, Babylon the Great, that sits on many waters. All of these enemies want to eat us for lunch. And the book of Revelation says that Jesus is going to throw some of these enemies into the lake of fire. And on Easter, Jesus, the powerful one, the Son of Man, Jesus defeated all these enemies, every dragon in the book, every demon, every devil, and yes, even death. Jesus is present in the midst of the 7 lampstands, in the midst of your mess, and he's present not in weakness now, no, he's present in power. Power. John wants us to see that Jesus is also present to purify, and make us clean, wash us up. In the next verse, he sees Jesus dressed in a robe, that white robe that is on the front of your bulletin. If we would take a close look at what this white robe is, it's the white robe of the high priest in the Old Testament. That's what Exodus chapter 28:31 teaches. That Christ now is the high priest. And what do high priests do? You know what high priests do. They purify people. They wash people. With what? Blood. Open your eyes to see Jesus as present to purify. And of course we know that he uses his own blood, right? That's why in the book of Revelation he's called the Lamb 28 times. He's the slain Lamb who comes in our midst with blood to purify. Purify. There's more to this purifying, though, of Jesus. John goes on and says, Jesus, his head and hair were white like wool, white as snow. In the book of Revelation, white is this prominent color that describes the believer, right? Revelation 7 verse 14 says that believers are standing before the throne of God with their white robes washed in the blood of the Lamb. More cleansing, more purifying from all of the dirt of my deceit, all of the slime of my self-centeredness. This high priest washes us, purifies us in blood. But there's more purifying. John sees Jesus, and his eyes were like blazing fire. What's up with that? Fire, as all of us know, purifies. Fire takes a precious metal and burns off all of the ugly dross so that that metal is shining brilliantly. So what's the fire in the book of Revelation? Oh, we'll see through these 7 churches. Fire is suffering. In fact, in Revelation 1 verse 9, John uses the term suffering. And the Greek term there means to get squeezed, thlipsis. It means to get squeezed. That's how believers understand suffering. You're getting squeezed. And what happens when you get squeezed? Stuff comes out. What comes out? Self-centeredness, self-righteousness, self-centeredness, self-righteousness. All of what is so impure in my life gets squeezed out so that we shine in radiant brilliance. Jesus is present with power over all of these demons and devils, and he is present to purify, not only with his blood, but also by allowing squeezing to get rid of all the dross. And I got a lot. John also wants us to see that Christ is present to promise. His voice was like the sound of rushing waters. And in 1:16, he says that the sharp double-edged sword comes out of Jesus' mouth. Both highlight the power, the sheer power of God's word. The sound of rushing waters, of course, means there's a whole lot of shaking going on, right? That's what Easter's all about. Matthew chapter 28, verse 2. And Matthew says, on the first day of Easter, there's a great earthquake. And since then, every time Jesus speaks, there's a whole lot of shaking going on, right? His word has authority and power. And the promise is exactly this: victory. Victory. Anyone who has spent any time in the book of Revelation knows it's all about victory. In fact, each of these 7 churches in Revelation 2 or 3 are promised victory. And you know what the Greek word for victory is? It's Nike, right? Nike. Long before Nike came along selling us all this sports apparel, it's a Greek word. Victory. Victory. When Jesus says you're forgiven, there's victory over guilt and shame. When Jesus says you're free, we're free from all sin. When Jesus says you're loved with an everlasting love. When Jesus speaks, we feel the earth move under our feet. He's present to promise, shake things up, point us to victory. Finally, John says, Christ is present to protect. In his right hand, he held 7 stars. The right hand in the Bible is a place of authority and status, right? The right hand in the Bible is a place of power and strength. And who are the 7 stars? The angels of the 7 churches. And who are the angels of the 7 churches? Brace yourself. The pastors, the messengers. We all know that if the enemy can destroy the pastor, he will destroy the church. So the pastors, these 7 stars, these 7 angels, they are protected in the right hand of Jesus. And John chapter 10, verse 29 says, it's not just the pastors, it's finally all of us. Jesus says, no one can snatch you out of my hands. You're protected, you're safe. In a place of status and honor and authority. We are right-hand people, every single one of us. So this is no gentle Jesus, meek and mild. This is no safe, sentimental, syrupy Jesus. No, this is the Jesus who holds the keys to death and Hades. This is the Jesus who is dead and is alive forevermore. This is the Jesus that John falls down flat on his face before. Can you imagine that? And John says, I felt as though I was dead. What does Jesus then do to John? Revelation 1:17 says that he reached out his hand and touched him. His right hand, actually, the hand of power and status and honor. And then Jesus says to John, don't be afraid. Well, what does all that mean? It means that Jesus is tough. Oh, he's tough. But he's tender. Jesus is sovereign over all heaven and earth. But he's saving. Jesus is in control, but he's full of compassion. In this moment, right now, he reaches out his right hand to you and gives you confidence and gives you courage and gives you a bounce in every step. And he says, when you see me in all of my glory and splendor and power, don't be afraid. I was looking at this a couple weeks ago. Maybe you know this. But you blink 20 times a minute. 20 times a minute. So that means that you blink, and I blink about 1,200 times an hour. And if we did the math, we would blink 18,000 times a day. Which means 10% of our waking hours, our eyes are closed. Except, of course, when you're listening to me preach, right? For about an hour and a half a day, in our waking moments, our eyes are closed. We're blind. We don't see a thing. How often in my Christian life are my eyes closed? Then what happens? I drag through my days. You know how you drag through the days, and you limp through life, and you plod through your problems, and you just don't see anything but what you can physically see and touch and handle and taste and smell. But today, John wants us to open the eyes of our heart to see who? Jesus. Jesus, who is present in the muck and mire and mess of our lives. He's in the midst of the 7 lampstands. Never forget that. Jesus is present with power over every enemy. This Jesus is present to purify every sin. He is present to promise victory, and he is present to promise protection. We are in his right hand. I think the blind man in John 9:25 says it best, right? What an awesome testimony. I was blind. He says, one thing I know, I was blind. But now I see. I see Jesus. I invite you now to stand and celebrate this awesome Savior.